I also want to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people in what's now called Vancouver. And as I mentioned last time, I think it's important that when we talk about food systems and agriculture and land use decisions, we acknowledge that most of the lands that are farmed in BC are on unceded Indigenous lands. And that these lands were used for, or were and are used for food systems, Indigenous food systems, and have been for thousands and thousands of years. And last, as you may know already, this series is a project of SPEC. We are a charity that develops practical solutions for urban sustainability. We're driven, or we are very much volunteer oriented, and we do education, research, and advocacy in the areas of food, energy, transportation, waste, and climate change. We have monthly meetings with teams who discuss and launch projects in these areas and sustain existing projects. So I'd really encourage you to get involved or reach out to us to collaborate or volunteer if you have the capacity to do so. And so without further delay, I'll pass it over to Drew and Allison. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself there. Excellent. So I'm going to also share my screen to get us going. Oh, 1 second. That's not the screen I want to share. Okay, can you see my screen okay? Excellent. Great, welcome everyone. We are, Allison and I are really excited to be here this morning. We've got a lot of content that we've tried to pack into a very short period of time. So let's jump into it. My name is Drew, and I am here on the unceded traditional lands of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam First Nations, as well as the people of the Hunkaminam language group. It's very beautiful and sunny out right now. And I have been working in integrated pest management since 2015 with ES Crop Consult, and ES Crop Consult is a company that provides integrated pest management services, and we also do research throughout the Fraser Valley and also into the Pemberton Valley. Yeah, we're gearing up to head back outside and be in the field once again, same as all of you. And just in light of it being International Women's Day, I just want to send some appreciation to my co-facilitator, Allison. I started at the same time as her at ES in 2015, so we've been working together for 6 years now. And yeah, I want to say, Allison, that I love getting to work so closely with such an incredible woman, and the agricultural community that you work so hard for and care so deeply for is really lucky to have you.
That was lovely. Thanks. Thanks, Drew. Yeah, so my name is Allison Middlestat, and as Drew said, I'm working at ES Crop for 6 years. I'm mainly focused in berries and blueberries. I also work in raspberries and strawberries as well. And I also just wanted to say that I'm working today on the shared unceded traditional territory of the Katzie, Semiahmoo, Kwantlen, and other Coast Salish peoples. Great, yeah, let's get started.
Okay, so the main objectives for today over this next hour and a half to 2 hours that we're going to spend with you is that we want to basically provide you with some structures that you can then take and apply to your own farm system. So I want to acknowledge that every farm is different and complex. And so we're going to go through 3 different main frameworks for you to be able to take that and apply that to your specific growing situation and your specific challenges that you face. So we're going to go through the 6 key components of integrated pest management. We're going to go through a problem-solving framework to help with identification of your pest, mostly with disease. And then we're going to go through a decision-making framework related to management decision-making. And then, yeah, the other thing that we want to have some space for today is to allow for all of us who are here participating to share in our field experience and knowledge with each other, not just Allison and myself. So this is in part because if we were having this workshop in person, we would all be together in a room and you would be able to talk to each other and have some conversation. So we want to have some space for that. After the hour and a half where we're going to be throwing a bunch of content at you, we are going to stay on the line for a half hour from 11:30 to noon to allow for some general question and discussion time. And yeah, Allison and I also just want to acknowledge that while we have a lot of experience working directly with growers on IPM, we mostly do work with mid to large scale growers and those sorts of operations. So we want to acknowledge that we have things to learn from you about the management that is most relevant to you and your operations as well. Okay, so some housekeeping points to run through here. Please put your cameras on if you can, especially when there's going to be times where we're going to ask questions of the group and we might stop sharing our screen. It's nice to see people's faces. So I also understand if you can't have your camera on, there's a lot going on at our homes where we're working from. So with your microphones, please make sure that they are turned off when you're not speaking. We are going to be running this workshop through this Zoom interface, and we are going to, at certain parts where there's going to be some activities, we're going to have breakout groups where you'll have a chance to kind of interact with a smaller number of people. And also in those breakout groups, we are going to be using some documents that we're going to share with everyone through Google Drive. So there's some handouts that you'll need to access, as well as some kind of activity worksheets that you will work together collaboratively on with the people in your breakout groups. And Georgia is just working diligently right now to make those breakout groups and put them together. So we'll get into the Google Drive stuff in a little bit. Also, if you're having any technical issues, please just let us know through the chat. Contact Allison or myself or Georgia, and we will try to help you out. And some ground rules going forward. So through the Zoom interface, it can be hard when you have a question or when you have a comment that you want to share. So please either input that information, those questions, those comments into the chat, or you can use, there's a hand up button in the reactions section of Zoom. So down at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says reactions, and then you have the option to put your hand up. So those are some ways that you can be engaged. We're going to take a brief break after about an hour of content. So just a heads up about that. And we're really going to do our best to end as on time as possible with all the things we want to get through. So we are going to do our best to adjust things as we go, but related to that, we're going to do our best to stay on topic as well. So there might be a number of questions or discussion points that come up through the chat or otherwise that we may opt to put sort of into this parking lot so that we can address that during the open discussion time at the very end. So just something to keep in mind. If we're not able to address it in the hour and a half, there is this half hour afterwards that we are going to try to use for that content. So I just want to check in with Georgia and see how she's doing with the breakout groups.
The breakout groups are I have them ready to go. I'm just gonna type people's names into the chat so they can see which groups they're in. So that should probably take 2 minutes.
Cool. So maybe what we'll do is perhaps we'll move forward into the introduction overview of integrated pest management while Georgia is typing that into the chat. And then after we do that first overview of IPM, we can make sure that everyone's clear on how to access the Google Docs that they need and that everyone's clear on what breakout you're a part of. So I am going to stop sharing and pass over to Allison.
Great, thanks, Drew. I'll just get things set up here. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, I just have to. Skip past some things here. Great, yeah, so I'm gonna just give a bit of an overview of integrated pest management, or IPM. So what it is, it's a system of crop production that helps manage different pests that you may find in your field. Oh, apologies. So this includes insects, diseases, or weeds. And you use a combination of tools to manage these pests in an economical and environmentally sustainable way. So trying to use all of the tools handy to, provide the best care to your farm. So there are 6 main components of IPM, and I'll go through them a little bit more, but I'll just run through them right now. So there's prevention, monitoring, sampling, identification, threshold and tolerance, management, as well as evaluation. So I'll start off by talking about prevention. So this one is a very important part. It involves planning ahead so you can stop a pest from becoming a problem. And it's about how you manage and design your farming system for the coming season so that you can plan your best management practices that reduce the risk of huge problems for those pests that you know are always going to be there, but you can help prevent them from becoming a huge issue, or just preventing the introduction of new pests into your farming system. So prevention is very key in IPM. Next, I'll talk about monitoring. So there are different protocols are out there that I'm sure some of you have seen. A lot of monitoring protocols are for larger scale operations, but for smaller operations, it's really easy to do monitoring while you're doing your other farm activities, such as applying fertilizer or weeding. It's just being observant in your field. So you're looking for anything that just doesn't quite look normal and keeping an eye on this. You're just going back week after week, looking at your field, seeing if something wrong is happening, and just being observant about that. You're looking for any changes in your field health. And again, doing regular checks is important so you can watch for any changes. And it's also good to revisit after you've applied any management, but I'll kind of touch on that a little bit later. Next is identification. So it's very important before you manage anything to actually know what the problem is. Sometimes it can be a pest problem, and sometimes it's a different kind of problem, and such as like irrigation or some fertilizer issues. And we'll kind of touch on that a little bit later. But again, knowing what the problem is exactly is very important. And then you can move forward from there, kind of figuring out what about the pest is the most important, such as life stage, like what the life stage is that is the most manageable, or what's actually attacking the crop, as well as what is the most manageable part of the life stage of this pest. So there are, you may have heard of different thresholds for certain pests before. And this is usually a specific number or a specific percentage of your crop that is affected by this pest. And so it kind of tells you, it helps guide you when you should manage this pest. There are quite a bit of thresholds out there, But usually the research that has gone behind creating these thresholds is more focused towards larger scale operations. So for small scale operations, it's good to look at thresholds through the lens of just being tolerances. So it's more of a tolerance that you, as the grower, decide looking at your crop, or as dictated by the consumers, what the tolerance level is for the specific pest. Some pests, there's just a complete zero tolerance. As soon as you see it in your field, you know you have to do something. But others, there's a little bit more leeway in there. And then based on these tolerances, you can have your action threshold, so when you actually want to manage. So we finally got to management, the thing that people are always kind of asking for when a pest issue approaches in the field. But say you've been going and observing your field weekly, you found something that doesn't quite look right. Then you've gone and taken it to a lab or done some research, and you've ID'd what this pest problem is, whether it be a disease or insect, and you've looked a little bit more into it and found the life stage that is the best time to manage. And yeah, it's gotten to a point that you want to do something about it. And so now you head into the management. And in IPM, it's usually referred to as the management toolbox, which some of you probably have heard before. It's about using multiple methods to attack the pest. So you're getting at it from all different angles to do it in the most effective way. So there are 4 main components of the IPM management toolbox. And these are more of just guidelines to show you that you don't just have one option to manage anything, you have a bunch of different options. And yeah, these are usually categorized in cultural. So this is about how you can design your growing system to help decrease pest pressure. Physical, how you can physically move or exclude the pest. Chemical, what products you can apply. And then biological, so how can you promote beneficial organisms. And lastly, there's evaluation. And this is essentially the exact same as monitoring and sampling, but you want to make sure you're looking at your field after you have applied your management. And this is important to see if your management even worked. So evaluation is also quite key. I'll pass it back to Drew.
Okay, thanks, Allison. So that just gives us an idea of what we mean when we talk about IPM and what's involved. And before we go into the next section of things, I want to go back to logistics, everybody's favorite. So thank you so much to Georgia, who has put all of the breakout group information into the chat. So please take a look at the chat for which group you've been assigned to. And then what we're going to do next is Georgia is going to share the links to the Google documents that each group will need to access. So please do not click on the link that is not underneath the group you've been assigned to. And Georgia is going to join into group 1 to take Aditi's place. Thanks, Aditi, for letting us know your ability to participate in the breakouts. So I'm just going to let everybody take a moment right now, actually, to open up the Google Drive link that pertains to your group. And while folks are doing that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So now that everybody has the links corresponding to their groups, please, within your Google Drive, open up handout number 1 and breakout activity number 1, the documents that are there. We are going to refer to those 2 files in this next activity. Okay, so this next structure framework that we're going to go through is about problem solving your plant problem, trying to answer the age-old question of what is wrong with my plant? And this activity we're going to go through is actually adapted from an activity through Washington State University Extension. So I just want to acknowledge them and their work in this. And so essentially, there's a lot of times where we see a problem with the plant, and then the whole process is trying to know what is causing that issue. So this gets back to what Allison was talking about, related to identification and the role of identification in IPM so that you know what to do to manage later on. So there's sort of two main categories of what could be causing your plant problem. One is that the cause could be living or biotic, or it could be non-living or abiotic. And so in this activity, we're going to more focus on the disease side of the biotic causes. And that's because, in part, with insect pests, very often, not always, but often we can see direct signs of the pest either through their feeding activity or by being able to see the pest itself. And that's often a little bit more challenging with disease. So we're really going to be talking about this from the disease side of things. Okay, so the next structure, I guess, that I want to talk about is this concept of a disease triangle. And some of you might have already been introduced to this, but the idea is, in order to have a disease present affecting your crop, you need three main components to be working together. One is you need to have the pathogen, the disease itself, present. You need to have the right environment and the right conditions that favor that disease. And then thirdly, you also need to have the right host that will be able to allow that pathogen to thrive and survive. So this is just an important, it's very simple, but it is a really helpful thing to keep in mind when trying to understand the challenges that you might be facing. So I just want to jump into the framework now. So the main thing is there are these 4 questions to ask yourself. And the first 2 questions are relatively self-explanatory. They are questions that you're pretty easily able to answer on your own. I want to spend some time talking about number 3 and number 4. How is the field being affected on a macro level, and how is the plant being affected on a micro level? And these questions are all outlined in your handout number 1 in greater detail. I just want to talk through them a little bit right now. So talking about the field effects on the macro level. This is what the linear and repetitive pattern is referring to in your handout. This is what it looks like, or an example of what it could look like. And this is more likely being caused by something abiotic. So part of the reason of trying to identify these patterns is it helps to try to sort through what the possible causes might be. Of course, there's no absolutes, but just in general, it can help to try to differentiate. So for example, something like fertilizer misses, or a thing that Allison and I see out in the field pretty often, herbicide damage, those often show up in these linear and repetitive fashions, and those are abiotic causes. Another pattern, this is the individual and random. So this is more likely being caused by something biotic. In particular, a great example of these individual and random incidents of a plant problem in the field is a virus, where the vector that's transporting the virus, often an insect, for example, has made an infection and then it's moved to another part of the field. And there's not really a super clear pattern. The next example of a field pattern is field edge or diffuse. And this is challenging to differentiate between biotic and abiotic, because there's also a lot of edge effects that could be causing your plant problem. And often those things kind of work together. Maybe you have a wet edge of the field and that's causing issues, just from the field being wet, but maybe the wetness of that field is also creating the right conditions for a disease. And so you are having a biotic cause. Okay, and then the last field pattern to consider is this problem showing up in hotspots, where it's really centralized around a certain point in different parts of the field, or maybe even just in one part of the field. A good example of this is root rot. And again, hotspots are often biotic, but they can also be connected to an abiotic cause. So if you have a low spot in your field, again, causing a wet spot, maybe you have the right conditions that are being caused by that abiotic situation to allow for a biotic pest to have some impacts. So that's what these different macro level patterns, these are some examples of what they can look like to keep in mind when you're looking through your handout. Okay, so now let's go to the last question of those 4 questions. How is the plant affected on the micro level? So this is where you're actually looking directly on your plant to look for what we call signs and symptoms of whatever is causing your plant problem. So why it's helpful to try to differentiate between signs and symptoms is that signs are biotic causes only. And that's because when we're talking about signs, we're talking about being able to directly see a pathogen that's impacting your plant. So I've listed some examples here of, that first bullet point is a mistake. You could ignore that. But for example, like mycelium, sclerotia, spores. So if those of you out there have experienced rust issues in your field before, you'll know what that looks like. And then when we talk about symptoms, these are a bit more vague. So these could be biotic or abiotic causes. So these are things like seeing a plant being stunted or seeing a plant with weird discoloration, but we're not directly seeing a sign of that pathogen. And here's just an example I wanted to use to highlight this. So this is the same disease. This is botrytis or gray mold on lettuce. And I was presented with a what's wrong with this plant scenario myself. These are photos that I took in the field. And so basically there were plants that were dying back and they were seeing that issue in their cold frames and greenhouse before they were transplanting things out. And so on the left-hand side, you can see that there's this dieback or damping off is another way to refer to it. But it wasn't until things were planted out in the field on the right-hand side and the conditions were right that we could see the direct sign of that fuzzy mold. That is the botrytis. So that's an example of symptoms versus signs for the exact same cause. Okay. My PowerPoint is advancing automatically without me, so I might have to go back a little bit here. But what I want to do now is run through an example, basically, of how to use these 4 questions to deal with a problem that you're seeing in the field. So we're in a situation where it's just been really rainy, and you've gone out to take a look through your tomatoes, and you're seeing these weird lesions on the leaf of a few plants. And as you walk through, you see that there's even more plants being affected. You had not noticed any signs of this before the rain. It's come on quite suddenly. And then when you take a look through your field on a larger scale, this is approximately the pattern of distribution that you're seeing. So there's a couple things to note here. One is that there are multiple parts of the field, multiple different crops that are being affected. So your tomatoes are being affected, and that's where you noticed it first. And also there are these patches showing up in the potatoes that have really similar looking lesions on them. So doesn't seem like this pest could have, or this problem could have moved through the field, through the soil. Probably in order to jump all of those plantings in between them, it had to move through the air. And I would characterize this in terms of field pattern as maybe a combination of individual and random and hotspots. It's kind of hard to know exactly, but that's the combination of pattern that I would consider looking at this as a whole. And one other thing I want to note is down along the bottom of the field, there's a series of trees. That's what those very beautifully illustrated green circles represent. Oh no. And those are an area that's creating quite a bit of shade. So not only did you have rain, but you also had this shaded area. And so that's something to consider as well in terms of what are the conditions that might be created for potential disease to be impacting. So there was a bit of a spoiler that happened as my slides are advancing, but I'm curious if anybody wants to throw into the chat, based on this information, what they think could be causing their plant problem. And maybe for some of you, you saw those lesions directly and knew right away. That's very possible. Chat. Wetness favoring a fungus. Yes, definitely. Yeah, so noting that there's these wet conditions and that probably is leaning more towards a fungal disease or some sort of disease rather than something happening abiotically. Yeah, fungal issues, absolutely. Okay, so the fungal issue specifically that we're looking at is blight. Yes, thank you, Teresa. So this is a very beautiful and sad example of late blight, and that is a fungal disease to be concerned with. And so through this combination, what you would have to do is take this information and do some Googling. But looking at all of those pieces of information together kind of helps us to narrow things down a little bit more. Okay, so we are going to move on to having you all work through an example in your breakouts. So what we are going to do is everybody is going to go into your breakouts in a moment, and Georgia's just going to enable that for everyone. And we're going to spend about 8 minutes working through an example ourselves in these groups. So we're going to come back at about 10:45 to the main group. And you're going to use in your Google Drives the breakout activity number 1. There's a scenario that's been written out for you. We've kind of answered some of the questions up front about the situation and given you some pieces of information to try to answer some of the 4 questions. In particular, I want you to think about the patterning at the field macro level. And also, what are the signs or symptoms that you're able to see directly on the plant itself? I'm just going to try resharing my screen to see if I can advance the slides myself. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Let me try again. Okay, there we go. So these are the photos that are going to come up for you in your handout. While Georgia is putting those, making those breakout groups active, maybe let's just talk about this situation for a moment. So you have a field where you are noticing a bunch of stunted plants like this. And mostly it's all along this one edge where you have a ditch and also a hedgerow, but it is sort of moving out into the fields in a couple of spots you've noticed. You're not seeing it in any of your other plantings, like your salad greens or your peas and beans, but it's in this field where you have a bunch of different brassicas. So you've got kale and broccoli and beyond, and that's what's being impacted. Great, thank you, Georgia. And then when you take a closer look at the plants, you pull them up, you notice that the roots aren't looking so good. There's sort of this weird restriction around the roots that's happening. So with that information and with the handouts that everybody has, we're going to send you to your breakouts. The breakout groups will close automatically and send you back to this room. And Allison and I are going to check in on you to make sure that you have all of the documents and things that you need. There might be a little bit of chaos, but sometimes you got to risk the chaos through the virtual setting to get the interaction going. So Georgia, are we good to start the breakouts?
Yeah, I'm just going to open them now, and it'll just take a second to send everyone to their groups.
Great.
There we go. It's done.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, see everybody in the breakouts process. So group number 3, I've already told them I was going to pick on them. I'm curious about, what did you note about the field distribution at the macro level? What did you come up with there?
Yeah, so we wrote that it was affecting the field edge and it was slightly diffuse.
Excellent. Good.
Yep. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. And so I would add that it's hard in this situation because it's the field edge to know, like, how is that being distributed? Is it happening through the air? Is it happening through the soil? It's kind of leaves you with a challenging situation. The other thing to note there is the hedgerow and the ditch is the edge where the issue seemed to be most concentrated. And so I'm sure you all noted that, but that's just another thing that you can add to your own field notes for yourself in a future situation. Thank you, group number 3. Okay, group number 1, I'm gonna pick on you next. What did your group note about the plant or the micro level, what you were seeing?
I will just go to that answer. 1 second. The micro level. We noted that we kind of didn't have a very linear conversation. We kind of jumped all over the place. We wondered, we didn't get a very good answer to this one, I don't think, but we did look at the root of the plant because that was what was available in the picture. And we just had a conversation about how that looked and whether it was being affected.
Perfect. Yeah, that's the spot to kind of zero in on. That's excellent. Yeah, I would say that these signs and symptoms are a little bit vague as well, so leaving you with also a challenging situation. And yeah, I would say, you know, these agroecosystems we're working in don't necessarily function particularly linearly, so I'm glad that your conversation also wasn't particularly linear. That seems suiting. The notes that I would add about the micro level impacts there is that we were seeing symptoms of wilting or stunting of the plants. So those are some symptoms I would note. Also, some other symptoms were that the roots were being girdled, right, kind of at the soil surface. And also, I don't think that the picture really showed this, but there's not very vigorous root growth. So for a plant of that size, even with the stunting happening, we kind of expect the root mass to be a little bit larger. And if you were to dig up a healthy plant right next door and compare them, that's also another useful tool to compare to the healthy to kind of help you notice what the differences are. So I guess I'm going to just put it out to the group. Are there any guesses, but from anybody, about what could be causing our plant problem here in this situation? Ooh, I see in the chat from Molly, clubroot. That's a very good guess. That's a very good guess. And I would say that perhaps early signs, very early signs of clubroot might look similar, where you're seeing kind of actually just like reduced plant vigor, and you're not really seeing the giant clubs on the root like you do once the disease has advanced a little bit further. So it's a fair guess, very fair guess. Any other guesses? Something that nibbles, yeah, to girdle the root. Also a good guess. And actually, that brings me to a good example of a lookalike that is a pest issue. We've got a point here. Someone says, we definitely thought it was fungal. Excellent. So yeah, it is a fungal disease. In this situation, I would diagnose this as rhizoctonia, or wire stem is another common term used for this disease in brassicas, where you see that girdling of the root and really severe stunting, and often sometimes just eventual death of those plants. And this is a soil dwelling organism. So it's sort of a combination of, you have this, the soil organism that perhaps already was existing in the soil there, and you had the right conditions with the wetter soils. Then you kind of had this convergence of all the factors in your disease triangle, like we discussed earlier. But it also could have been introduced on your transplants. So sometimes that rhizoctonia comes in from your plugs. And so that's another thing to consider in that situation. Yeah, and so the lookalike, the pest lookalike that I do want to mention is that cabbage root maggot. After the maggots are gone, after they have pupated and they're no longer directly on the roots, sometimes their damage can be a really strong lookalike for rhizoctonia or wire stem. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and that's where you want to be trying to catch the pest directly. So if you can catch the insect directly, then that really helps you to rule out wire stem as a possibility. Actually, you're seeing cabbage maggot impacting those transplants. Awesome. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I want to share my screen really quickly again before we take a brief break. Okay, so say you're in this situation and you don't have a me there to be like, this looks like wire stem, and I've seen wire stem before, and these are the symptoms that I'm familiar with. Sometimes you need to send that mysterious plant thing to a lab, especially when it comes to disease. And so I just want to highlight that there is this plant health laboratory through the Ministry of Agriculture in Abbotsford. And they can be accessed through the URL that's on the screen there. And on their website, they have a form that you need to fill out to be able to submit with your sample. They also have instructions on their website about how you should take a sample and what they're looking for with what you submit. It's really important to pay attention to those instructions. Yeah, the one last thing I want to say about that is that the framework that we've given you, those questions to ask yourself, basically all of that information goes onto these sample submission forms. So you've already done that work for yourself in trying to figure it out on your own. You have all of the things that you need to put onto this submission form, essentially. So all of that hard work is not for nothing if you do decide you can't figure it out on your own and you need to go to a lab. Okay, so going into the break, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back at, let's come back at 11:03. And over the break, think about this activity we just went through, and maybe what is one thing that you could try this season. I'd encourage you to write it down for yourself as well, so that you don't forget. All right, welcome back, everybody. we are going to jump into our next activity. So I'm going to share my screen. So this next framework that we're going to go through is about more focused on management rather than identification. So if everyone could please go into the Google Drive folders that they have again and open up their handout number 2 and breakout activity number 2. We're going to be working through that. And so while people are opening up those documents, really this framework is a series of questions to help organize just the onslaught of information that can come when you start to Google about a particular pest. And so these questions are kind of at the point where you've done some monitoring, you've done some ID to know maybe which pest you have, you've figured that out. But now you need to flesh out that information about the life cycle and the pest ecology, like Allison had mentioned earlier on. And also to gather all of that information to help you with thinking about, okay, what is my tolerance or threshold that I'm operating off of? And also, what are my management options that I can take into consideration? Okay, so feel free to read through the handout number 2. I'm just going to basically read out some of the questions that are written on that handout. So to start off, we have some pest questions to gather information about. How does the pest affect the crop? How does the pest grow, or also what conditions does that particular pest prefer? How does the pest move around in the field? Where is the pest located in the field? Is it above ground? Is it in the soil? Does it like to live on the leaves, in the roots, etc.? And when is the pest most active, and what is its general life cycle? So these are questions to answer as you're looking at information about a particular pest. All right, so then we're going to move on to some management questions also to consider. Which stage of the life cycle are we the most concerned about? Which stage of the life cycle can be most easily targeted? So sometimes the life stage that causes the most damage is not actually the life stage that we are most able to have an impact on. So it's important to note that. When, so the timing, when should management occur? And then this is a question trying to relate to your specific growing scenario. So what challenges do you foresee in managing this pest in your particular growing situation? And I would say that this question is a good one to ask even after you've come up with your big brainstorm of different management options that are available to you, thinking about, okay, of these options, how do these apply to my situation? And what might be some challenges in applying some of these management tools? And that might help narrow down what you can actually implement. So those are the questions to try to give some structure to all of the information that might be out there for you. And I want to go through a particular example of crucifer flea beetle, which is a question that was submitted by one of the registrants in advance of this workshop. So, and Georgia, this is a heads up that we'll go into breakouts after we go through this example, just so you know.
Okay, great.
Okay, so flea beetles, there are these little beetles that are about 1 to 3 millimeters in length. And crucifer flea beetles in particular, they feed on all sorts of different brassica crops. They cause these little tiny holes. Sometimes they go all the way through the leaves. Sometimes they go partway through the leaves. Here's an example of a lot of them. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with this site. And one thing I want to note about crucifer flea beetles and flea beetles in general is that there's a lot of different types of flea beetles out there. And so in this case, I'm going to assume that we know clearly that this is the type of flea beetle we're dealing with, but just be really careful with your identification of flea beetles. There's also a couple of common species around here are striped flea beetles, which also feed on brassicas, and tuber flea beetles, which don't care about your brassicas. They're going to feed more on your solanaceous crops. So potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, they'll get in there. They're mostly concerned for potatoes. So it's just important to know correctly which pest you're dealing with, because they're all going to have different impacts. Okay, so I'm going to call these guys CFBs also, just because it's easier. So for the example of CFBs and brassicas, I have taken my list of questions, I've gone to the internet, and I've gathered my information and tried to find the answers to those questions. There's a lot of information to unpack, and so I'm not going to go into every single detail, but I've gone through and I've answered my questions, and these slides are going to be available to you after the presentation. Georgia's going to share these slides, so don't worry about reading every single word that's written down here. The point is, I went through the activity and I answered all of the questions. And the main takeaways were that the adult beetles feed on the above ground plant parts, and that's what I really care about. They're very mobile. They tend to start out at field edges because of the way that the adults overwinter, and they can be as active as early as March. And there's at least one generation in the field season. It depends on how hot the summer is. There can be more than one generation at times. So those are the main takeaways from answering these questions. So with that information, I then was able to go to the next set of questions. Which stage of the life cycle are we most concerned about? The adult. Which stage of the life cycle can be most easily targeted? Also the adults, that's above ground. Every other life stage of this pest is below ground. When should management occur? So based on the information I've gathered, really I want to try to manage early, because when the plants are small at the less than 6 leaf stage, that's when their feeding damage can really stunt or even kill the plants. When they're larger, often they're a little bit more able to handle some feeding damage. Also, we want to act early because we want to prevent establishment of the growing population in the field as it moves into the field. And as those overwintering adults lay their eggs to start a whole new generation, we want to protect our plants from that. And then this is the question that really depends on your growing situation. So I've just come up with some examples. So maybe it seems like this pest is quite well established because they've had a lot of high pressure in the past. So there's this history that I need to keep in mind. Also, I know that I have a lot of alternate brassica weed hosts. That's kind of allowing the perpetuation of the life cycle for this pest. So those are things that I might want to keep in mind. So then, after we've asked these questions, what we want to do is start to think about our IPM toolbox that Allison introduced us to earlier. And in your handouts on page 2, Allison and I have provided you with a list of potential management tools. It's certainly not exhaustive, but it is a list of ideas of different types of management for pests that you might be able to apply to a given situation. So you want to brainstorm all of the things that you think could apply to this pest. And you're not crossing really anything out just yet based on your own growing conditions. You're going to think about that after. So I'm going to say that I did that. I went through this list of options, keeping in mind that the target for our management are the adult CFBs. And this is a list of all of the options that I came up with that could apply. So I actually have a resource that I found about organic management for crucifer flea beetles. That's really quite excellent. And I'm going to share that in the chat in a moment. So I'm not going to dive into the details of all of these different management options, but if you care about crucifer flea beetles, I will share that resource and you can dive into it yourself. But the point I want to make here is that there are a lot of different options. We don't just have one possible thing that we could do. And so now we want to take a look at these options and apply them to our situation and think about what are the options that will work for me that I can actually feasibly implement. And I just want to highlight a few things here. So the main option that I would say people use for CFBs is using row cover. And so if you decide, yeah, I'm going to use row cover to physically exclude the flea beetles from accessing my plants when they're moving into the field after overwintering, you just know that you need to do it well. If those flea beetles are able to get underneath your remay or your netting, whatever you're using, then they're going to be able to exist without very much pressure from any natural predators. They're going to be able to lay their eggs and establish that generation that we know will come in the season. And they'll be happily there, able to feed on their preferred host plant. And we also know that row cover can be really hard to deal with weed management. And so because we know that the plants are the most susceptible when they're really little, then maybe depending on what we're growing and how high our pressure is, we're going to use that row cover until the plants are large, and then we're going to get rid of the row cover because that's the trade-off that we're willing to make with the weed management that we also need to do. And the other point I want to make here is that just to remember that management options can interfere with each other. So for example, if we chose to apply a spinosad spray, which is an organically certified spray that you can use for CFB, if we're also trying to use pollinator strips to encourage our predators, then that spinosad spray is actually quite general in terms of the numbers of insects. It's not very target specific that it affects. And so that could really interfere with this other management tool that we're trying to implement and reduce its efficacy. The last thing I want to say is that crop rotation is notably not listed on here on this list of management tools. And I want to point that out because that's a go-to. Even for me, I'm like, okay, what are my options? Crop rotation. That is a tool that I can use to try to manage this pest. And it's actually not recommended for this particular pest as a thing to prioritize. You might want to prioritize it for other things, of course. We're not recommending against crop rotation, but in this case, because of how active and mobile CFBs are, it's not really going to have much of an impact for this particular pest. So there's not always a tool that applies to every single pest that you're dealing with. Just another thing to keep in mind. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Allison to introduce the activity we're going to do with this.
Great. I will just steal the screen from Drew here. Great. Yeah, so in the Google Drive, if you go to the practice number 2, we have created a scenario based on some questions and concerns that were brought up to us prior to this. So we have given you a scenario and given you all of the answers to the pest questions, so that first section. And we're looking for you guys to go through and answer the management question and also come up with some management tool options. And then we'll come back as a group and we'll go over these together. And we'll give you about 8 to 10 minutes to work on this together. But we're good to head out to the breakout groups if Georgia, you're able to get that ready to go.
Great, I'll just open the rooms now. And I'll just quickly mention if folks do have to leave right at 11:30, then we'll be sending out the slides and a recording and a link to an evaluation form later today. And it would be great to have you fill out the evaluation form, but hopefully you can stick around for a little while. Okay, opening the rooms now.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. Recognize that it was a very bit tight on time, but just mainly to kind of get you used to the working through those questions. Excuse me. Get things shared again and we'll kind of go through. So as far as the management questions, I'll just go through answer those with the research that I had done ahead of time, and then we'll work more together as with the management tool options. So yeah, the scenario, you are growing these salad greens and you're noticing that these slugs are a problem. Went through, got some information about slugs, and now we're gonna figure out what management we can use. So stage of the life cycle we're most concerned about is definitely as soon as they hatch, from young to full maturity, they can be out there munching on your things. Young to full maturity, again, for the focus of the management, there are some management that you can do with the eggs, like you can disrupt them a bit, but definitely most of the things are focused on the actual adults. Management can occur preventatively, so before you plant anything or in the wintertime when they're still sleeping. Also, it can be done ongoing, depends on the management method. And some challenges that I had come up with, mulching is necessary, especially in this scenario, something very useful, but also unfortunately, it creates the perfect environment for slugs to hide and breed in. Slugs and snails, they're also a very weather dependent pest. So you don't know what the season is gonna look like. If it's a hot, dry season, the pest pressure will likely be lower than if it's a wet and humid or wet and cool summer. And also some management options can be very time consuming. Maintenance of if you're doing trapping or if you're setting up some barriers, there's just different things that can be, you have to spend a little more time if you're hand picking the slugs off. Did anybody have any other concerns or any other comments that had been brought up in your breakout groups? And you can either, if you wanted to put it in the chat or something, if you want to, whoops, put your hands up. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat when I'm sharing the screen here. So, oh, here we go. Nope.
Do you want me to read out from the chat, Allison?
Yes, please. Sorry, I can't seem to find it there.
Yeah, we've got a comment here that the raised beds give a lot of nooks and crannies.
Yes, indeed. Lots of good hiding spots for them there.
We have another comment here, and I see there's a hand up. A question of what to do with the slugs once they've been picked. So that might be a challenge that you'll need to face.
Indeed.
Karen, you had your hand up?
Yeah, are there any, like the positive insects or that will attack the slugs specifically?
Yes.
I know ladybugs go for aphids, but slugs, yeah, what is it? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, there are some generalist predators. I mean, some of the things that I was seeing online were like if you encourage frogs or garter snakes, like those types of beneficials. There are the only, let me just see here.
Maybe we can jump into that when we go with the management options that come.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a very good question though, Karen. It's a really good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Art, you have your hand up as well?
Yeah, just having had experience with slugs at a micro scale with a wooden raised bed, a wooden framed raised bed, and also in the field out in Delta, I think that disrupting slug habitat is a key factor, and that could be vegetation at the edge of the field. It could be tillage at that field edge to prevent slugs from moving into the field. And in my case, I got rid of my wooden frames for the raised beds. I don't agree that raised beds are necessarily a problem. It's the wooden framed raised beds where I've seen slug eggs accumulate along the edge of that. So I think habitat disruption and consideration of what that means in your situation is a key factor. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, definitely disrupting that habitat is one thing that has been widely recommended. And yeah, getting rid of the wooden borders, can help also dry out the soil a little bit more instead of keeping it nice and moist along the edges. Yeah, great. Thanks, Art.
One last comment in the chat about this, maybe before we move on, is that one group noted that slugs are present all year in our climate really here. And so that's a big challenge with them.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely this past year, there was a lot of slugs active because it just didn't get to those summer temperatures that we sometimes have in August and July, and it just stayed pretty moist. So yeah, definitely a problem down in this area. Great. So yeah, moving on to management options. We've already talked about a couple, such as managing any weeds around or removing a wooden structure if you have raised beds. I wanted to go through the different breakout groups to see if you had just one of your management options that we can discuss. Well, I guess we'll start with breakout group 1. Did you guys have any management options that you had come up that haven't already been mentioned, perhaps?
We actually didn't really get to the point of talking about management options. We just sort of went through the first part.
All right, no problem. You can hop over to number 2. If you guys had anything.
Just related to wood, like also getting rid of all the like debris that might be around your beds that doesn't need to be there. And I think Art mentioned ducks.
Yes, that's definitely one thing that I have heard of, is having chickens or geese or ducks and having them pick off in some cases it's easier than others. Some places you aren't allowed to have birds wandering around for a while, but yeah, definitely an option. Great. Breakout group number 3.
We said I stick beer cans on the edge and kind of like put leaves leading into the beer can so that they fall in and die a drunk death.
Perfect. Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I have seen as well, having those pitfall traps.
Mm-hmm.
Beer is definitely one of good bait. Also, I've seen yeast and honey mixture. So just kind of that yeasty will attract them in there, and just making sure that the trap is deep enough that they won't climb right out again. But yeah, definitely a good one. And then breakout group 4, you guys have anything different?
We had a couple. One of the gals suggests uses Sluggo, and I've been trying to do no-till and do like a deep mulch method of gardening, and it's just been a slug apocalypse.
Yeah.
And so I've been researching there, and now we'll only be mulching with fully composted material, so there's no food and hiding places in there.
Great.
That's the plan change.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so I'll just put up on the slide here some of the options that I had found. Yeah, removing hiding places, we've already talked about that, cutting the weeds back, and the trapping. Yeah, one thing, Molly, that you could try is also having, like, setting up some pitfall traps in there to see if you can catch some of them that way. One less pleasant is hand picking them as you see them, especially at night, because that is when they're most active. And as far as the question of what you can do once you've picked them off, I've heard people just destroy them, like hitting them with a hammer or cutting them up. Like, those are some of the things that I have heard of people doing. Yeah, just physically destroying them. I'm sure there are other options out there, but those are the ones that I have heard of the most. And then, yeah, baiting with some iron-based products like Sluggo, yeah, ferric phosphate, other iron-based baits. There's also, you can plant repellent plants, so some that are much more aromatic, like lavender, like they're less appealing to the slugs, and you could potentially have a hedgerow or like a headland around your planting area of these different, and if slugs are already within the borders of it, it would kind of be a similar situation to what Drew was saying before with the CFBs being trapped under the exclusion netting. They would kind of stay inside. But if you planted those and then picked out all the slugs that you had seen and done your management within the borders of that, that could be something that could help. I do have a link on here, which I also will put in the chat pretty quick, of a great resource that I had found. It's University of California, they had this slug IPM fact sheet, as well as just a whole page that had more detail of some of the options that you can use for slug management. Yeah, so that's a good thing. As soon as I stop sharing my screen, I can put that in the chat for you to access. Great, yeah, and I'll pass it back to Drew now for our closing remarks.
Great, thank you, Allison. So recognize that we are past 11:30, so we'll just really hit a last few points here. I just encourage everyone to take a moment at some point and think about what's one thing that you could try this season based off of this framework that we've just gone through together, and write it down for yourself. And just to recap what we've gone through, we went through the 6 components of integrated pest management to give you an overall structure of ways to look at your system. We went through a framework about problem solving your plant problem, especially if you think there's a disease going on. We went through another framework about decision making around management. So considering what your options are and gathering all the information that you might need to help make the right management decision for your operation. And we wouldn't be good instructors if we didn't leave you with some homework. So your homework is to basically take these frameworks that we've gone through, take those handouts that we've given you, and use them, apply them on your farm this season. We won't be following up on that homework, so we won't know if you actually did it or not, but we'll just trust you to do it. And I want to just throw some recommended resources up here quickly for people. There's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of good extension sites and various things. These are just sources that Allison and I tend to go to regularly. So the PNW handbooks is sort of an aggregation of information from different universities in the Pacific Northwest, particularly based out of the US, but they are relevant. There is information that can be helpful through the BC Production Guide. The Ministry of Agriculture in Ontario often has some really helpful resources, and also University of California has some IPM resources. So just when you Google stuff and things come up, sometimes adding these qualifiers helps to narrow it down, and these are ones that Allison and I use regularly. There are certainly other ones out there. And then just, well, I want to end on a shameless plug and also a pun. We've been working at ES on a project for the past couple of years trying to compile some integrated pest management field guides for small scale operations. And we are launching those this year. We're also going to launch some IPM workshops through that project. So if you are interested in that, if any of that sounds interesting to you, please send me an email. I've thrown it up on the screen. I'll throw it up later. And I'll add you to our email list for when we're sending those field guides and the workshop information out. And those were meant to be tailored more for small scale operations. And now, with the time that we have left for folks who are able to stick around, we want to have some open question and open discussion time until noon. Here are Allison and my emails for people who want to get in touch. We're happy to, answer some more of your questions and continue some of these conversations also past noon today. So thank you all for participating, and we'd like to open up the floor for some questions. I'm going to stop sharing. My screen. There we go.
Thanks so much, Drew and Allison. That was great. Yeah, and I guess folks can put their questions into the chat, and one of us can read them out, or you can feel free to just unmute yourself, put your hand up, whatever you feel comfortable with.
I also have a question that had been submitted by a participant before that I could kick things off with, if there isn't a burning question right now. So there was a question about sourcing a beneficial to release into like a covered hoop house, cold frame, greenhouse situation that doesn't necessarily receive much heating early in the season. So trying to find a beneficial for aphids or thrips that is relatively cold or colder tolerant. So I just wanted to pass on some thoughts about that. Basically, yeah, it's a good question and a challenging one, because a lot of the beneficials that are used for aphids and for thrips for release in more like greenhouse settings, they often have a particular temperature range and also relative humidity where they're the most active and the most effective. And those tend to be like 20 degrees plus Celsius and a relative humidity of, I mean, it depends, but like 70% plus. And so I think that really the main thing to do is to contact the biocontrol suppliers for timing and rates, and also specific information about activity. Like, they truly are the people who understand those products the most, and those products are expensive. And so you really want to make sure that you are paying for what you need and want and what's going to work for you. So I would say that BioBest and Applied Bionomics are two places that we've gone to in the past for research and projects that we've done. I know that there are folks that I've worked with who have got information through TerraLink, which is another egg distributor. So those are just some considerations around like biocontrol suppliers that you could reach out to, because they really will have more detailed information that they can ask you specifically about your operation. I will also say that there are a couple of pests or a couple of beneficials that tend to be a little bit more cold hardy. For thrips, Aureus, and I'll put it in the chat. Different species of Aureus, they tend to be a little bit more active at in the colder range. But when I say colder, I mean like 15 degrees Celsius. So not that much colder. Also, hoverflies or syrphid flies. Those tend to be active at a bit cooler temperatures. They're not really ones that you would buy and apply as a biological in the same way as maybe some of these other options that are out there. I would say for hoverflies and syrphid flies, like, you're wanting to encourage them to be around through planting pollen sources, because the adult forms of that particular insect, that's what they feed on. It's their larval forms that feed on the aphids. So you need to make sure you're providing a food source for the adults. And that's just a good general rule for trying to encourage beneficials. Often it's the larval form, not always, but often it's the larval form that is going to be feeding on the pests that you're trying to target. But then the adults, they actually feed on pollen. And so they need a pollen source for them to have their full life cycle.
I see there's a question in the chat from Colleen. I had lots of issues last year with pill sow bugs in my raised planter boxes and beds. Any tips, suggestions on pest management for these critters aside from removing mulch?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, pill bugs and sow bugs, and it's one that I didn't encounter until working a little bit more with folks who operate in more like urban settings. One of the things I know I came across in the past was the use of diatomaceous earth. So those pill bugs, sow bugs, they're like little mini crustaceans. And so the ways that their bodies are protected is different than from other insects that we tend to deal with. And so that's like an irritant on their bodies that can be used. I know that like I have had conversations with other growers, they don't like to use diatomaceous earth because of like respiratory reasons, or because of they have children around and they get in there with their hands, and so it's not like the be all end all answer there necessarily. I do have a document that has a compilation of some information about that, Colleen. So I'm just gonna make a note. I'll email you the document that I have about
Thank
bugs
you.
and sow bugs.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've also found with the diatomaceous earth, you have to reapply it so often, especially when it rains or it gets soggy, right? Even if you have drip irrigation, it just turns into sort of sludge and disintegrates. So it's not effective anymore.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, and I know it is really challenging, and the list that I came up with, it certainly isn't like a silver bullet anything on there, but I can give you what I have, definitely. Teresa, you had a question about downy mildew?
Yeah, I've been battling it for a few years, and I've done the sort of standard stuff where, you're keeping the leaves dry and making sure there's lots of circulation around, and specifically basil, around the basil.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's been like nothing seems to work, and the black plague comes over the entire basil crop every year. And I'm just wondering, I don't know what else to try. Like I've tried covering it because obviously it rains a lot, and so of course the leaves get wet. But then you're kind of restricting the airflow if you're covering things, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what else to try.
Yeah, I haven't dealt with downy mildew in basil before. That's a new crop and pest combo for me. When you're growing them, are you growing them from seed outside, or you're starting them inside and then planting them out?
Yeah, inside in a greenhouse and then moving them out when it gets warm.
Yeah, okay. Do you see any signs of the downy mildew on your transplants before they go outside?
No, but I know that my neighbors also like experience the same thing. So there's something in the air, the soil, where we are. It's very moist. We're right beside a cranberry farm. So we're prone to a lot of mildews and funguses, but I don't know. Other than don't grow basil, I don't know what else to
do. Yeah, it's interesting. How much of the covering have you said you've tried covering it a little bit? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a tough one.
I guess it's timing too, because I cover it once, but once it's present, like even one little tiny spore, if you encapsulate it in a cover, then you're making it worse, right? So
yeah, definitely. Yeah. I know with downy mildew in other crops, like the weather conditions are really important.
Yeah.
And so like there are certain regions where they've developed models to track the conditions, and also track, like they have spore traps set up to tell that spores are in the air. And that's more for a conventional system to alert growers that they need to apply like a preventative spray, because of what you're saying, once it comes, can really take off quite quickly. I don't know if I have a good answer to that, other than that I know the environmental conditions are really important for that, and it can really take off if the conditions are right. My suggestion, I guess, would be to, if you're looking up more information, to look into those environmental ranges that are relevant to downy mildew. And then part of your monitoring is not just monitoring, oh, is the downy mildew present on the plant? But okay, what are the environmental conditions? I know that I have a lot of pest pressure for this. In terms of what you can do once you know that you have those environmental conditions on the horizon, like based on checking the weather forecast. The thing that really comes to mind for me is a biofungicide application as a preventative spray, but that's kind of up to you whether or not, that's something you want to do in your operation, but that would be my suggestion. monitor the conditions, maybe make a preventative biofungicide application. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
We had another question from Camille. Clubroot and overliming as a response is a huge issue for my team. Any pointers would be helpful, and feel free to elaborate, Camille, if you want to.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that, Camille.
So we have a schoolyard garden on a really high hill with weird soil, and it's like right above a big slope. So you'd think drainage would be really good, but I think because it's very urban and schoolyardy, there might be problems with drainage because of like concrete being buried somewhere, or something that's keeping the slope intact, some sort of structural thing. I don't know what's going on, but basically, yeah, we just have clubroot that like affects about 90% of our brassicas. And so, yeah, coming into it, I think they've been liming for 5 or 6 years straight, because it's like brassicas are such a cash crop and so important for our market garden. So I'm at this point now where I'm looking at the pH levels, and it's affecting everything and everything else's growth. So it's just like a vicious cycle. My approach and my thinking is just to amend with really good compost and just not grow brassicas and just like start a new plot somewhere else on another schoolyard. Like, yeah.
Yeah. That's really good to know. And I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of coming to that reckoning yourself, but there is a point with certain fields and certain locations where you just need to not grow brassicas, and it does kind of sound like you're maybe at that point. Yeah, and that's hard. Like, and that's hard. Yeah. It really impacts, like your cropping plans and your marketing plans and so many things. But the nice thing is that it sounds like you do have other site options. Right. So I think to take advantage of that, you do have other sites. And so what can you grow really well on this particular spot that's not brassicas?
After amending with everything. Yeah. And then, so how long do you think that it's necessary to wait? Like how many seasons? 7 seasons?
At least 7 years. Yeah. Which is, again, that's the hard truth. But I will, maybe a couple of things to add to that. Okay, one is that if you do have clubroot, if you have anything that's like really impacting, it's a disease in particular that's impacting your roots. Also with other insect pests, whatever you can do to increase the rooting vigor of those plants while they're in the field, even before you put them out into the fields. I do know growers who there's certain things that they do to their transplants before they put them out. Again, this is a product, but like there's Root Shield, which is an organic product that is often used to protect and try to invigorate root growth before they go out into the field. So if you have, maybe it's not a thing you do everywhere, but for this field where the soil situation is tough, maybe that's a choice you make, right?
Cool.
I think all the things you're saying about amending, that's where you want to place emphasis for sure. The last thing I guess I want to say about clubroot as well is to really make sure that you have basically like a biocontrol protocol and like a phytosanitary protocol in place, so that I guess like a combination. First and foremost, you want to reduce the amount of clubroot that's going to other locations. So and that's you might actually need to like write up a phytosanitary protocol and implement it. And if you have more questions about that, that is something that we do, like in our work, and I'd be happy to share some of the phyto stuff that we do.
Cool. What about solarization? Is that weird? Is that like, since I'm not going to be able to grow anything anyway, like because we work with youth, so I was thinking of turning the solarization into a project. So it could be kind of fun. But like, does solarization work? Like,
solarization works.
Yeah.
I don't know how effective it is in clubroot specifically.
Okay.
But yeah, it certainly works for like weed pressure. You could do some interesting stuff related to that. I saw a talk this winter actually that was about like not just solarization, but I can't remember what term they used. It's a combination of solarization plus using organic amendments.
Yeah,
so that
I've seen that.
Okay, great.
So you boost the temperature. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
So I think that that could be cool to try. I don't think it's necessarily something that's going to help you with your clubroot. Sadly, it might.
Yeah.
But I don't. There's not really, like any evidence related to that. So, but I love this idea. It's like, okay, how can we use this site differently? And not for brassicas, and that's okay. There's maybe some like great opportunities that you can like shift to instead, you know?
Totally. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
If there's time, there's one last question from Greg. Any ideas to deal with deer besides fencing?
Yes, Greg. Yeah, Allison, do you want to speak to this at all, or?
Yeah, I did some looking into it. Unfortunately, fencing definitely is the main thing, whether it is full exclusion fencing around your entire property or like little separate fencing around different trees or different smaller areas. Something else that I had seen was using audio scare devices or having a dog that helps scare it off the property. Fortunately, like couldn't find anything outside of fencing that people had sworn by. I will share a link. Again, it's to the same place, the University of California IPM that I had shared earlier with the slugs, but it's around deer. So you could maybe check that out. There are some more specifics of different ways you can use exclusion fencing. So it's not just around your property, but unfortunately, so I don't have too many new ideas on that one.
Karen, I know that you had a question earlier about slugs that maybe we could just go back to and touch on briefly. Allison, I don't know if you,
As far as like insect predators, there aren't really that many. There are some that like, for example, that California link, they have a predatory snail, but that's it's very specific to that certain area. So definitely not something that should be brought out of California. But domesticated fowl like ducks, geese, chickens, as we had mentioned before, I think those are really the only things besides what I had said earlier of like snakes and toads. Like those are just some more natural predators, and just if there's an opportunity to encourage that sort of wildlife. But of course that could have some adverse effects as well. But yeah, unfortunately there aren't too many biological organisms in that aspect that you can have.
Camille's just thrown in the chat that she's seen voles and crows eating slugs. So
they're definitely everybody enjoys slugs to eat them, it seems, but we don't enjoy them in our gardens. We're the only people or the only creatures that don't enjoy eating them as much as others do, apparently.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of like generalist things that like to eat.
Yeah.
So, there's different ground beetles, carabid beetles that like to eat their eggs, but the same things that encourage slugs encourage the carabid beetles. So, you're kind of like creating an ecosystem for both of them to have a good time.
Yeah.
So,
thank
you.
Yeah, no problem.
The way I get rid of mine, because mine is actually, it's one of the community gardens, actually 3 community gardens in Vancouver here. So with the one that has the big problem with them, I take them and I put them out on the road either the cars or the bugs, the birds to get them then.
Yeah, that's a great solution.
How I do.
And yeah, as far as what to do with slugs, I had looked a little bit into it as well. Like after you pick them off of things, another thing you could do is put them in a bucket of soapy water.
Yeah.
That's another solution to that problem.
And then pour that over the road.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah,
Thanks
no
everyone.
problem.
Thanks for sticking around. I think we'll wrap things up. But yeah, please know that if you have some other questions, that you can get in contact with both Allison and myself. Georgia's going to send out some other documentation as follow-up, including the slides that we used in this workshop today. And yeah, if you're interested, I'm going to plug it again. If you're interested in those IPM field guides for small scale growers, please send me an email and I will put you on the email list that we have for it. And I think that we'll leave it there. So thanks everyone. Good luck with all of the prep for the upcoming season, and I hope you can enjoy some of the sunshine today.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.